Welcome, everyone. Today I have a quick chat with Scott Berkun. If you don't know Scott, he's an author, speaker, consultant, can I say?
Sure.
Uh, the thing is that he wrote several books, and one of them is The Year Without Pants. The fun fact about this book is that it was published like 11 years ago, and this is the book about remote work. And because it was published 11 years ago, it was published before remote work was hip. And and actually, this is what I want to talk about with Scott, because what brought me to this conversation is your comment, a random comment on LinkedIn, which went something like that. Measuring productivity is almost as much of a joke as the magical faith in returning to offices. And then I went ballistic. Actually, I didn't. But we exchanged some comments under that post, and this is what I wanted to spend like 15 to 20 minutes talking about with you, Scott.
Yes, I'm excited. I felt that you went ballistic. I was so upset by your comment. I was outraged. I'd never had a comment on a LinkedIn post before that I disagreed with. It was the first time this has ever happened. So I was shocked by it. I'm still shocked by it now, and I can't wait to try to sort out our disagreement with you here.
So do explain yourself.
Okay.
Why the belief in return to offices is magical?
I think that what you make these little posts, these little snarky comments somewhere, and it comes probably, I think when most people do it, it is coming from a legitimate place of a specific argument that they have in their head. But then you're working quickly and you're doing something else. So you make these sweeping statements that are obviously not entirely valid. I think the one that where it was coming from for me was I generally feel like there was this big opportunity with the pandemic and everyone being forced to do remote work for more companies that had bad reasons for not doing it to discover that it had at least some value. Not that they had to make everyone do it, but often the way that we learn and grow is when we're forced to do something that we've been avoiding. And then you're forced to do it, and you're like, oh, this is not what I thought it was. This is actually a little bit better or has some upsides. And then now you are wiser and smarter. And in this context, as a CEO or an executive, you have a wider understanding of the different ways people can be successful working for you. And so when the retreat started happening about probably 2 years ago, when the COVID numbers went down and people realized that they did not have to be so restrictive, the retreat started happening, and there were CEOs who were saying these outlandish things about how terrible remote work is and it destroys culture. And I think that's part of where my comment came from is
Mhm.
this retreat that was not smart. It was a stupid retreat for some companies to just throw out the whole idea of remote work. And so I can't remember the article that I was commenting on, but that's where that came from was people who are I think it goes both ways. And we can see if we have some agreement here that making everyone work remotely is a mistake because not everyone likes it and it's not good for every company for sure. That's dumb. And saying that no one should ever do it is also dumb. And my comment was coming from a rejection of that second argument that no one should do it.
So first, a disclaimer. I At Lunar, we tend to bring more people to the office, but the general comments that I hear about the reasons why the companies bring people back to the offices are, in my opinion, uh, mostly very shallow and not
Okay.
very well thought through.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that these are the actual intentions. I'm saying I'm just commenting on how they communicate. So this
Okay.
is my start. This is my starting point. And yet, the situations that we see is that more and more big techs, like Amazons and Googles of this world, bring more people to the office more often.
Yes.
And this is a trend that keeps progressing. So my challenge to that discussion, even though I think that those companies still communicate that not very well, is that
Hmm.
why are they doing it? Because
Right.
those companies are known to be data driven. They're known to base their decisions on data, and yet it all started like the recent wave of comments started with Amazon forcing everyone to come to the office from the new
Hmm.
year, right?
Yes.
So why?
Oh, you're asking
They should,
me?
yeah, they should. I mean, they should know.
Yeah,
Um,
okay. So I think that they may have data, but their goals may be different than yours or mine in how you manage a company. I think that Amazon, I live in Seattle, so I've never worked for Amazon, but I'm very familiar with the culture from the many people I know who do work there or have worked there. And Amazon has a very short-term view of their employees. Like they work people very hard. They don't necessarily expect their employees to stay at the company that long. A lot of Silicon Valley companies have the same idea. They know their average retention for an employee is probably 3 years, especially for engineers. So they're not, their data is about how do we get as much out of our employees as possible in the short term. Um, that's not to say that all of Amazon's policies work that way, but I could make an argument that Amazon's data is about working people as hard as you can and then expecting them to leave because they're unhappy or burnt out. So there's reasons they could have data that supports what they're doing, and it's still not in the best interest, in my opinion, of the long-term interest
mhm.
of that company or in the best interest for the employees. That would be my argument for why Amazon is doing it. Actually a better argument, not a better argument, an argument closer to the what took place in our LinkedIn discussion was that um, I I suggested that part of what's going on is executive culture and
Mhm.
executive preference. And data driven is a weird, not weird, but data driven can be a suspicious defense for a choice because data is very manipulable. And depending on my biases and how self-aware I am, I can look at any data and invent an argument in the data for my position.
Mhm.
And had you been in the same room, you could have invented an equally data-driven argument that's entirely different. They're both data-driven, but they're different arguments. And so in my post, I was poking at what I think is there's definitely some executive preference. Executives and middle managers like to feel powerful, like to feel important. And that is something that happens in remote work. If you're not around all your people and watching them work, you have to trust your employees more. And I think some executives really just don't trust their employees and feel like they need to be um, have more visible ways to observe them and manage them in order to feel comfortable in their job.
Would that be also true for Microsoft? I know that your years at Microsoft are like long, long ago.
Yes, I am
Uh,
old.
uh,
Yeah. That's a really good comparison. I don't know what's the CEO of Satya, I think, at Microsoft.
yeah.
Um, he's very well loved and respected there, and I think part of why that's true is that when he came in, he had a different attitude about a bunch of things, including how employees were treated. I don't know that much about what he has said about remote work, but I suggest that part of the difference there is him and a less common view of all this than most of the other tech companies have. But I confess I am ignorant there. I can't tell you exactly
Yeah.
why Microsoft has. I also know I live about 15 minutes from the Microsoft main campus, and during COVID, they had this gigantic renovation of the campus. I mean, it must have cost $1 billion or hundreds of millions of dollars. And the question was always, well, they've invested so much in real estate, as many big companies have. They're surely going to force people to come back just because of how ridiculous it is to have that much money caught up in real estate that you're not using. So I've thought for sure they would do closer to what Amazon has done, and they haven't. And I know that they do like encourage 2 day a week. They do hybrid, like encourage hybrid,
Yeah.
that if you really don't want to, you don't have to. But most teams have some kind of 1 day a week, 2 day a week, more people come in. So they are doing like it seems like a successful hybrid model, which is unusual too.
Uh, so the argument about real estate, it's like again, like if you look at the data, it sounds if you made people come to the office just because of, you know, renovated offices, it's like this is sunk cost anyway.
Right.
And you're, you know, like it's like playing a lose-lose game. You know,
Yes.
like the you 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 could sell those offices. I mean, earn some money and keep
Right.
people happy if that was the premise. So that's
Yes.
kind of another angle that I won't take that I
Yeah.
want to take is um you
Yeah.
started saying that there are people who want to come to the office and there are those who don't. Um your prediction then, like just play guessing game, is the job market going to eventually evolve into companies that are, have a office preference versus those that are remote first, and then people would be choosing the jobs, using just yet another aspect of the job. I prefer to work remote, so I don't even look at Amazons of this world.
Right. I took a quick look before we got on this call just to see what are the largest companies that still do remote work. And
Nvidia.
Nvidia, Atlassian, there's still quite a few. Microsoft, there's still quite a few. And so when I look at the landscape seems reasonable in terms of how many companies are still very positive on remote work and still allow it. So there's definitely, I think, I couldn't find any trend data from like 2020, pre-pandemic, pandemic, and now to see what does that chart look like for total
Hmm.
number. I couldn't find one. And actually, after this call, I'll keep looking, and if I do, I'll send you the link just so you can add it to the
Thank you.
to the
Yeah.
post because I was curious. I'm sure someone had to do it, but I couldn't find it. And when I looked at this list, I was like, maybe this makes sense. It makes sense some companies would retreat back. It makes sense that some companies would discover that it's preferential and stay with it. And it would make sense that a bunch of companies are in the middle and they're doing some kind of hybrid thing. And so from my quick look, it looks like that's what happened. And I'm guessing there's probably more remote jobs in the tech sector now by a significant margin than there were before. And I think
Yeah.
that will stay. I think that the companies that have now made it part of their um, company culture is really hard to shift. Like I said, the pandemic really forced people to have to try it, and some of them made discoveries. So um, the hybrid stuff is complicated, especially if you were an older company with a more traditional culture. You were forced into this, and the hybrid stuff is trickier. But for these other companies now that forced their way through and have figured out a balance, maybe we've reached an equilibrium, and maybe whatever the number is right now, let's say it's 20% of the workforce supports remote work. Maybe that's the right number. I could accept that as like a reasonable. Now it becomes part, like you said, it becomes part of just it's another choice that you make as an employee about what your preferences are for where you want to work. I always use the example of commuting, that for a lot of people, they're willing to commute. They will commute an hour each way to do a job. That's 2 hours a day. They're willing to sit
Yeah.
somewhere and hopefully read or relax. Hopefully, or they're stuck in traffic somewhere, but they're willing to do that. It's a trade-off they're willing to make. I would not make that trade-off if I didn't have to, but some people are willing to make it. And remote work just becomes another trade-off. It becomes another either preference that you prefer strongly enough that you'd never take a conventional job, or the other way that you hate remote work. It doesn't work for your lifestyle. It doesn't work. You're not productive that way. So now it becomes something you would never do. And it's just another preference that everyone can choose or not.
So I want to circle back to one thing that you
Hmm.
mentioned twice or three times, which is uh, the remote versus office work and the company culture.
Yeah.
So let me share you a story. And this
Okay.
is this is this is our story, and it's like the shortest version of it is we are a technology company changing from we were before the pandemic we were office based almost purely, like pretty loose working from home policies if you wanted, but the norm was you come to the office.
Hmm.
And then the lockdown started and we switched to remote work for straight year and a half, everyone working from home. Now what I believe we built is was a very diverse team. Like we really did good job building that team. We
Hmm.
didn't do nearly as good job of building an inclusive culture though. Now, as long as we've been meeting each other at the office, you would have those signals of connections, those random interactions, when you're fetching yourself a coffee, chatting about
Hmm.
the weekend, whatever. And whenever, there was some tension between people, I believe that this was the way when we were like kind of unloading that tension. Then we switched like this to working remotely, from face-to-face communication to written communication, from synchronous communication to asynchronous communication. What's worse, the office language is English, which is not a native language for anyone at the company. Like
Hmm.
we tend to speak good English, but
Right.
still. So there are like so many reasons to misunderstand the other person. And
Hmm.
then you read that comment from someone who, for whatever reasons you had a tension with, and you filter that message through your lenses, through your prejudice, your
Hmm.
biases, like everything. And you answer not to the intent, but to the, what you filtered through your filters. And it's obviously, you add to the emotions, and then you get on top of that. Like long story short, tribal war happening in pretty small organization, 30
Okay.
odd number of people. Uh, a year later, we've lost 20% of employees. We've lost
Okay.
20% of people. And my interpretation of that whole situation was that because we lost those signals of connections, which build sense of belonging, we actually had that huge conflict, and we actually had that huge issue with at the company.
Mm.
So I would say that, and I'm interested in your perspective on this because of two things. So first of all, we are talking about the big techs, and in their context, the culture is, you know, building the culture or changing the culture is like a very different beast because there are those humongous organizations, and you cannot just, tweak one thing and something you have somehow you have something different. And the second reason is your experience with Automatic, where
Hmm.
you've had, if I remember correctly, three people in a team in the original
Yeah.
team,
Yeah.
and you did great job like building this remote collaboration, and also not only within your team but also between you and the CEO, and yet it was kind of a smaller scale.
Yeah.
So your take on the impact of like those huge changes in remote, go back to the office on culture, uh, in
Okay.
situations where it's not designed, as in Automatic, it was designed from the day one to be a
Yes.
remote company. But most of us are living in a world where those things just happen to us.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. The first thing I will say is that culture is this really important thing. It's a very sensitive thing. What makes one team or company or family, like what makes it healthier? It's among the most important factors, and it's a very fragile, sensitive, subjective thing. Very, very hard. And I admit that remote work, we're not biologically, we are built to be in the same place with the people that we're doing stuff with. I totally true. Science says so. We feel it in our bodies. So there's definitely something there that is important. And so at Automatic and most companies that have always been remote work companies, they've always invested, most of them have always invested in getting people who work on the same team together in the same place at least once a year, if not several times a year. And Automatic did that. They still do that because they know that. They know there's something special about having dinner and going out for drinks or whatever with the people you work with. So when you don't have that, it does add a layer of an extra layer of friction. I don't think that it's insurmountable, but it's definitely a factor. And so what you're describing in your experience, that makes sense that going to remote work did probably make it harder. How much harder? Like that's where we could debate, but it's obvious biologically that there's something that you have to compensate for. That said, I think we all know relationships we have in our lives where we are not in the same physical place with people. We are still very close. It could be a family member. It could be someone you went to high school with that you're still in touch with, but lives hundreds of miles away. and you only interact with them remotely. Some of those relationships still are function really well and are important. So I think there's room on both sides to say, yes, there's more friction created if you're remote, but it's not insurmountable. There are ways to try to manage it, and we all know in our living experience that we can work effectively or have healthy relationships with people even if they're not nearby. Um, to your point and your question about Automatic, one thing that Automatic had or has as an advantage, having always been remote work, is they were self-selective from the beginning for people who were good at remote work and communicated well. So you called out the language difference, and obviously that's a factor too. Obviously, um, but Automatic, to get hired there, you'd have to be a good communicator to get through the interview process. And then in the first month of working, you'd have to be a good communicator. And their spoken and written language is English, which is also a second language for probably at least a third of the company, probably more.
Hmm.
But they hire people who write really well. I noticed it on my first day. It's in the book. I'm like, I'm in this environment where everyone's kind of a writer. This is great. People are thoughtful and like ask clarifying questions. And I think that's part of what, when I'm asked to advise companies on remote work, communication skills now become really important. And people who are good at recognizing miscommunications. That's a big part of being a good communicator. When someone says something to you and you go, did you mean this or did you mean that? Right? That's a healthy check. And if everyone does that in a culture, the miscommunications go down because now everyone's looking out for these corner cases. So I'm rambling a little bit here. So there are things, the book talks about some of them, that you have to, as a leader, have to demonstrate the behavior of how to get the most, how to reduce the downsides of remote work. But they can be done. And um, often when a company tells me they're struggling with remote work, part of why is they're not great communicators. The leaders are not going investing in the things necessary to reduce the downsides of remote work, including making it easy for people to get together at least once a year. Um, the only other thing in there I wanted to call out is there's always this in-person romance about the hallway conversations and the water cooler and the coffee. And some of that's definitely true, but the fallacy in that whole view is that it has a very skewed idea of serendipity. Um, Online is serendipity all the time. Like when you go on TikTok or Twitter or whatever, like you're being collided with information from all kinds of different sources. And the same thing is true if you have a Slack channel where people are posting stuff. Um, so, and it happened for us on LinkedIn. You saw me post the thing. You're like, you didn't plan your day saying, I'm going to wait for Scott to post today because I want to have a
I
conversation. No,
totally did. I'm doing that. I'm a stalker. No,
but
I'm not.
so, but you get my point though, right? And that
Yeah.
happens inside of companies where you didn't plan a thing, but someone posted something. You may not even know them well in your company, but they posted something. You respond to it. You go, oh, they're talking about this. I have a question about that. And you post it, and now you're having a conversation with someone that was not planned, and now you get to know them better. And maybe you have a side chat in private messaging, and you've made a connection. That happens all the time in digital spaces too. Um, it may feel different for it to happen in a hallway, but this digital hallways at healthy companies with good cultures where the same kind of idea generation and collision of perspectives that results in better thinking happens all the time. So there's a weird romance at tech companies for non-tech serendipity, and I think it's just it needs to be recognized. The same thing happens in the digital spaces too.
Actually, I mean, this story just like opens, a whole swath of questions. But let me park it for for now. Let's not make it like hour and a half rambling uh on stuff. I would definitely want to catch up with you for some follow-up later on. And I'm taking some thoughts
Okay.
regarding especially regarding that part, how to design, because I believe you have to design it, how to design those interactions offline.
Yeah.
We tried a lot of things. I know it's hard. Um, I believe it's doable. There are companies doing that, and definitely the part about communicate like good communicators. And I guess that's a part of the issues in many places where like we've been hiring people not focusing on that, and suddenly we are all
Yeah.
expected to be good communicators.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of funny
Scott,
as a last note. Everyone likes to think they're good communicators. So whenever I talk to a company like what communication is really important, like we're great at communicating here, and you kind of feel everyone in the room who works for them going like, no, no, we
it's
don't.
like everyone is above average communicator, right?
Exactly right.
Like
Exactly right.
it's in this research where 89% of drivers believe that their skills is above
Exactly
average.
right. Yeah. So that's a good last note about how people are not as good as they think they are, perhaps.
Scott, last notes, if someone wanted to reach out to you, like if this is gonna inspire someone to reach out to you to learn from you, read your books, hire you in any way, how to reach out to you.
ScottBerkun.com. All my stuff is there. And obviously we've connected on LinkedIn. So they should follow both of us so they can see it. They can wait for our next argument that will result in a Zoom call.
Um, I'm waiting with my nukes to
Thanks.
land
This
them
was
on you.
fun.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.